So, Professor Pinch,
Professor Lynch.
You might
tell us
begin
about
by,
your present circumstances.
you probably better begin by just saying your name. And
Yeah, I'm Trevor Pinch. I'm a professor at Cornell University in the Science and Technology Studies Department, and I'm an ex-president of 4S, and we're here in Denver at the 4S meeting.
Okay, and it's 2015.
Okay.
And you've been at Cornell University for what now?
I arrived in 1990,
1990,
before there was a
25 years.
Department of Science and Technology Studies.
25 years. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of your, not of your interest in STS, but of your education that led you into STS. So,
Well, I was doing this is 1970, I was doing a physics degree at Imperial College London, and I had come to do physics expecting to do exciting experiments on particle wave duality and stuff like that. And it was actually all boring, doing problem sets. I only got to understand this later when I'd read Thomas Kuhn and read about normal science, and that's basically the kind of stuff we were doing. And I was part of a group at Imperial College called Interaction, and this was at the tail end of the 60s. And I was brought up in rural East Anglia, and my goal was to get to London and get away from rural East Anglia and have a great time.
but you are still a Norwich supporter.
I am still a very dedicated Norwich supporter. We're back in the Premiership again. So it was an interesting time to be at Imperial College because it was the 60s still, even though we all know the 60s went well into the 70s. So we had this, I was a Marxist, I was a member of the International Marxist Group. A very close friend of mine was Piers Corbyn, who's the brother of Jeremy Corbyn, who's now the leader of the Labour Party, and he was in the International Socialists, and Piers' brother was in the IMG, and I was a radical Marxist and a physicist.
Was that common among physicists in those days, physics students?
There were a few. Physics is a kind of profound discipline, so it leads to sort of interesting political movements.
I understand you had some interest in music at the time, too.
Yeah. Well, I arrived at the freshest fair in Imperial, that's what we call it, with all the societies. And there was the Socialist Society. I joined that. On the table next to me was this weird machine making incredible noises. And that was the Electronic Music Society. And they had one of the first synthesizers in London, a VCS-3 synthesizer, which I years later discovered was the same synthesizer that the Pink Floyd used on Dark Side of the Moon. And as a kid, I built radios, shortwave radios. I had a radio set from a Lancaster bomber, which had an incredibly huge dial on it, and in rural East Anglia there's not much to do, so I just used to listen to the shortwave soundscape, and you'd hear amazing stuff. You'd hear bits of shortwave radio, Morse code, you'd hear stations around the world, you'd hear this strange droning noise, which was the Americans jamming Eastern European stations, or other noises which were Eastern European stations jamming Voice of America. And I heard the synthesizer, and I thought, wow, what is this instrument? So I joined the Electronic Music Society, and eventually I was in an electronic music collaboration, and we needed to build a synthesizer. And since I built shortwave radios as a kid, I could do the circuits, got some from Wireless World, so I built my own synthesizer and played it out for a year.
Did you have plans to build it from? Or?
Yeah, I had schematics from a magazine called Wireless World. But let me just tell you about the link with the International Marxist Group and Piers Corbyn. This group we formed called Interaction was for the study of physics, revolution, and LSD. Those were the three things together. And it was a sort of an interesting time. And a member of our group went on to become really famous was a guy called Fritjof Capra. And he wrote that book, The Tao of Physics. Yeah. And in those days he was at Imperial College writing just a textbook of physics, a pop book about physics. And he hadn't got this whole mystic Tao thing he got later.
The LSD helped for that, I imagine.
Yeah, it probably did. So I'm just trying to give you the brew that was around at that time. Physics, psychedelic drugs, electronic music. So this is where your president of 4S came from, the background.
And these threads through your life continue. Maybe not the LSD, but the connections.
Well, I owe a lot to Imperial College because I did a course in my third year of doing a physics degree. I was fed up with physics. There was actually something offered that was an early version of STS taught by somebody called Dorothy Griffiths. And it was Kuhn, Merton and Jerry Ravatz. And as soon as I started to read that stuff and we wrote essays, and because physics is all problem sets, suddenly writing was a pleasure. I thought, oh, this is great, this is a wonderful field. I should get into this field, this is amazing.
But did you finish with a physics degree?
Yeah, I finished the physics degree, and then I spent a year in London, and I was going to write science fiction. I actually had my own science fiction manuscript, and these are the days you could take it round publishers in the West End of London. I actually bought it round publishers. There's one small problem. I couldn't write. This background in physics, I just couldn't write.
Is that something that's persisted through your career, I imagine?
Yeah, well, you know very well about this, Mike Lynch, for that wonderful first book that you wrote. We can improve. Now, for those of you out there watching this, the joke here is that Mike Lynch is one of the best writers in the field, but his first book, I think, Art and Artifact Laboratory Science, was a bit stodgy. He was influenced by this guy, Harold Garfinkel, and that style of writing. But it's not one of the best styles in the world. And I was probably, I could not write at all. So that didn't go. I was tutoring physics as well, for A-level physics. And I realized, and I was playing my synthesizer in a band, and I realized that a life as a musician and a science fiction writer, which I kind of dreamed of, wasn't really going to happen. And so I did a year of that, and then I thought, what am I going to do? And I remembered I'd done this course in basically STS, with Dorothy Griffiths, so this is before email, I wrote to Dorothy Griffiths and said, what can I do? I've done a course in this, I'm really interested in this. And she said, well, there's a master's program in this at Manchester University, you could do that, or there's one at Sussex. I got into the one at Manchester, which was called the Liberal Social Science Department, and I did a master's there in STS, and that's when I first discovered my real love for this, because...
So what year was that now?
1975, I started the master's there.
And it wasn't associated with sociology there?
No. I worked with a sociologist of science, Richard Whitley, who supervised my master's.
But he was in the business school.
He was in the business school, absolutely, yeah. And Richard had a list of projects. I was in his seminar, I remember this, and one of those projects was David Bohm and quantum theory. Oh. And one of the only parts of physics I really liked was quantum theory, so I said, that's me! And the project was to go and interview David Bohm, who's this was amazing for me, because Bohm was like a world-famous physicist who'd worked with Einstein, developed his own theory, hidden variables theory of quantum mechanics. And I went to interview him. The only trouble was I didn't know, not only could I not write, I didn't know how to interview. Because Richard Whitley was a terrible interviewer. He played one of his interviews for me, and it was all Richard's voice. And he's a very sort of, how would you say it? He liked the sound of his own voice quite a lot. Yeah. And he didn't know how to interview, and I didn't know how to interview. I had to write out all the questions beforehand. And when I teach research methods, I always describe the first question, which Richard passed, which was, in 1952, Professor Bohm, you developed the non-relativistic hidden variables interpretation of quantum mechanics. Why did you do that? That was the first question I asked David Bohm in the interview. He was at Birkbeck College. And he said, oh, we need to go back a bit. And it was a terrible first question, but that's because I was trained by somebody who didn't know how to interview. And then
by the way, Richard Whitley is not probably well known in STS these days, but he had written at least one or two very key papers.
Absolutely. He'd written this article on black boxism in the sociology of science, and he was actually critical of Merton. And he said that Merton was treating scientific knowledge like a black box. It might as well be meat pies that Merton was producing. Yeah.
He also wrote a paper that compared the styles of research for 3 or 4 different fields.
That was his thing, yeah. It was kind of big comparisons of different sorts of areas of social sciences and sciences, different sorts of sciences.
Whatever happened to him?
He became an expert on the history of business schools and really famous in that area, the sociology and history of business schools.
He's not still alive, is he?
I think so. I think he's still around, yeah.
Is it the Intellectual and Social Organization of the Sciences or something?
That's right.
Something
like
that.
an art typology.
Yeah. And, we won't go in there, but...
So I did my master's thesis with him on David Bohm and quantum theory, and that was the start of it all, into controversy. So I was doing an early controversy study. I didn't know what it was back then.
And was that the basis of anything you published?
Yeah, I published, let me just tell the story of when I came to publish that, because I was going to do a PhD at Manchester University, and Manchester Liberal Studies of Science is a really interesting place, because we just had the Forest East meeting in Copenhagen, and Alan Irwin, who had organised the meeting, there was the Dean of Copenhagen Business School, did his master's there. Fred Stewart, who is the president of our sister organisation East, he did his master's as well at the Liberal Studies of Science. And Sonia Lip, who's the secretary of the East, she was a contemporary of mine in that Liberal Studies of Science. So it's a really important place. I was going to stay on there and do a PhD working with a guy called Ron Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
And
He went to
meanwhile,
Australia afterwards, right?
yeah, he went. Yeah, he was Australia. He went back to Australia, to Wollongong, and I remember this. It was probably Richard said that, gave me an old advertisement. It was contemporary at the time, an advertisement that just said, "We want someone who can interview quantum physicists to work on a project with this guy Harry Collins down at the University of Bath." And Richard said to me, "This guy Harry, you should go for this interview. If you should apply for the job, and if you get an interview, you should go for it." I did get an interview. He's got lots and lots of data, but he doesn't have a clue about theory. And finally, when I got this job with Harry, Harry said, "You've worked with Richard Whitley, and he hasn't got a clue how to interview people. I'm going to show you how to interview people." So I went down and did this interview, and I was just incredibly lucky, because this was a project on Uri Geller that Harry was working on. He got some funding from the SSR
So
Social
give me the
Science.
date again. This is what, 72?
No, this is 76.
76 now.
75, 76. And I did this interview, and this was like, in American terms, it was like getting a postdoc position when you all you got is a master's. But Harry wanted somebody to interview quantum physicists, because quantum physicists were explaining what this psychic wonder kid, Uri Geller, was doing. He was bending metal by the power of mind. And this is all before people knew about Schrodinger's cat and all that stuff. And they were trying to explain it with quantum theory, including David Bohm. And so I was a guy who could interview quantum physicists. So
Now,
that's,
this was before Harry had his PhD too, wasn't it?
that's right. In those days, Harry had been hired from Essex University to do a PhD at Bath University. He got this big grant, which I worked on. He got his PhD probably about a year later. But at that stage, he didn't have a PhD.
But he was
either.
on the faculty.
Yeah, but it was normal back then. Barry Barnes didn't have a PhD. I was Mr. Barnes.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, this is how it happened. Sociology was expanding in Britain, and quite a few people didn't. It wasn't like this American professionalized thing where you had to have a PhD. You could be a Mister and still, or I guess it was gendered. They're mainly Misters.
So you begin on a project, but you then got into the PhD program there, right?
Yeah, but Harry hired me for a project, and he took me under his wing. I remember this, and he said, "I'm going to show you how to do the sociology of science. We're going to go out there and do those interviews together, and we're going to write a book together about this Uri Geller thing."
Which you indeed did.
He did, yeah, and he was very influenced by Peter Winch and Wittgenstein, and the idea was to write a book. The book eventually became Frames of Meaning, but it was to look at paradigm incommensurability. We were influenced by Kuhn, of course, as well. Look at paradigm incommensurability, but in a contemporaneous case. So
That
we picked.
came out about, what, 1981, something like that?
It came out, 82.
82.
And actually, Harry had a contract much earlier. Even it could have come out before Laboratory Life. So he had a contract in 78 with a publisher. And what happened was that we'd write something, and it's sent out to the publisher, and the publisher would, at that stage, use North American referees, and it would always be turned down. And we realised, hey, this is probably not going to get published. But at that stage, we didn't realise it was a book field either. We were thinking we could do this by articles. Harry had published this famous article, The Seven Sexes, Replication, so we thought it might be an article field rather than a book field. That only became clear later after Laboratory Life, because most of sociology is articles. So it wasn't clear it was going to be a book field.
Yeah.
So Harry he said, this book, we've got this contract, it keeps getting rejected, but let's not worry too much about it, let's publish some articles. And then, Laboratory Life came out,
Yeah,
I guess
1979,
79.
yeah.
Then Harry realised, my God, this is a book field, because he saw all the attention Laboratory Life was getting. So we did that study on Uri Geller and Frames of Meaning, parapsychology.
But your own dissertation research was on the neutrinos, right?
Yeah, so it was an unusual situation, because I was on the faculty of the University of Bath, like a kind of postdoc. Then I became a graduate student. I remember this, I had this sort of great faculty office, and I had to sort of leave it and be in, the sort of partitioned office with the graduate students. It was a really strange inversion. I wasn't, and this has been Britain, I used to be able to eat in the senior common room. Now as a grad student, I couldn't do that anymore. It's really strange. So all these people I've been hanging out with, I couldn't be with anymore. So it was a strange situation, and just reflected there were no jobs at the time anyway. It was just, this field was in its infancy back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only in retrospect can you say that. But
Back then it wasn't clear it was going to lead anywhere.
Yeah.
So, once we'd written the book, I'd had 2 years as a kind of like a postdoc with Harry, even though I don't have a PhD.
Right.
And what am I going to do? I'm going to do a PhD. Why not?
Am I right that your own book came out before the Frames of Meaning? Is that right?
No. My book came out on the solar neutrino stuff in 1986.
Oh, okay.
So the first book was the one with Harry on parapsychology.
Okay, so that came out earlier.
Yeah. And so Harry, by the way, another thing was I said earlier I couldn't write. He taught me how to write.
Uh-huh.
I always remember this. It's one of the most stressful situations of the days of typewriters, right? So this is before word processors, computers.
Uh-huh.
And he said, well, we're going to start writing up this project, Trev. And he wrote a paragraph on the typewriter, and it was really beautiful. He was a great writer. And he said, it's your turn. So he sort of turned the typewriter and said, you write something. And I wrote something. And he looked at it and he said, this is absolute crap. Now, what was great about Harry was he showed me why it was crap. And he said, now, why don't you use this word? And he moved these words around. And suddenly this, what was absolute crap, I agree now, became something much better. So he actually taught me how to write. And that was an incredible thing. He taught me how to interview better. Richard Whitley hadn't taught me how to interview. I did all the interviews with Harry on that Frames of Meaning book. And what he showed me how to do, Harry's kind of an aggressive guy. He showed me how you could interview aggressively. And he would, we were interviewing physicists, quantum physicists, a lot of that sort of stuff, parapsychologists, and he would sort of say, Professor so-and-so there says this, what would you say to this? And he'd give a technical argument and sort of get them to get the response. So I really learned this interview technique from Harry. So he taught me how to write, he taught me how to interview, he taught me the tricks of the trade for buying a car on the East Coast, selling it on the West Coast, to support your research. This is all part of the materiality of doing our stuff.
This is sort of irrelevant to your own career, but Harry was not trained as a social scientist.
He was. He had a master's degree from Essex University. He had a background in physics. He had a master's degree from Essex University, and back then that's where Howard Newby and Colin Bell were, who two of the most famous. So he had a background, but he was kind of like.
What was the master's in? It was
sociology.
Oh, it was okay.
It was in sociology, and he was doing a kind of network type analysis before.
Okay.
And that's how he led him to the
Okay.
two ladies. But he was a self-taught guy. He taught himself to write. He told me from reading Bertrand Russell, and that's how he learned how to write.
It should be known that
Our president.
at some point Trevor and Harry have written some stuff together,
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll get there.
Yeah.
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 So,
Frames of
you were
Meaning was
writing.
written by both.
You were writing together at that.
Yeah, Frames of Meaning, that book, that
Yeah.
we did write it together.
Yeah.
And so this, Trevor Pinch, who could not write and had his science fiction manuscript turned down, finally learned to write by working with Harry.
Yeah. Good for him.
Yeah.
And you.
And there's all, by the way, I should tell you this, that, because I came out of this, the whole psychedelic hippie thing. So we started to do field work in California. And one of the stipulations Harry said to me, he said, Trev, you've got to stop wearing your mother's coat if you want to come out to California with me and do these interviews. And I had this beautiful fur coat because that's what you wear if you're a psychedelic musician in London at the time.
Were these the interviews where you would rent a car and then sell it, or you'd buy a car and sell it?
Yeah, Harry's methodology was to buy a car on the East Coast, sell it on the West Coast, and you'd make a profit that would cover your trip. This particular trip he took me on to California, where I had my mother's coat. He made me not take my mother's coat. that particular trip was a rental car trip. We rented a car in California. It was just because the parapsychologists were all in California.
Okay, let's.
Actually, this is in an article
By the way-
this is in an article by Harry Collins.
Yeah. So I teach the student. I learned so much from Harry. Your writing is dependent on what you read.
Yeah.
So I was flying with him to California, right? I got rid of my mother's coat, and I was sort of halfway reasonably dressed. And he leans over and he looks at what I'm reading, and I'm reading Michael Moorcock. Now, Michael Moorcock was a very interesting science fantasy writer who played with my favourite bands in London, Hawkwind. He would read science fantasy on stage while the band were playing. Totally cool. Harry looks at this and he starts to read it, and it's not that well written. He says, Trevor, this is absolute crap. If you're
This
going
is,
to,
what's
I'm on the
name?
plane going to California. This is probably 1978, and we're doing this field work of these parapsychologists out in California. This is where I first met Bruno, by the way, on the same trip. And he looks at it and he says, if you're going to work with me on this project, this is the paranormal project, you're going to learn to read well as write well. And so he gave me, and he asked me, what have you read? You know, imagine this, he just says to you, what have you read? So I'd read a few things, like Hemingway and stuff like that, but I was a physicist. And he gave me a reading list, like Flann O'Brien, The Third Policeman, some really good literature to read. And I actually took it seriously. I took this away and read it, but I do have one resentment about it because, as we know, science fantasy and science fiction has a big impact in our field. And I could have been writing that stuff. I stopped reading science fiction and science fantasy to read this higher literature because Harry had instructed me to, but it probably was good for my writing.
Did he also have you read some philosophy of science and Wittgenstein and things of that sort?
We had to read, yeah, we had a study group on philosophical investigations. Harry's Bible was Peter Winch, The Idea of a Social Science. So we were getting our dose of Wittgenstein. But Harry's kind of philosophy, you probably know this well, Mike, he's spread this philosophy around a lot, is that basically he would say something like this: there are people in our field who write, and there are people in our field who read, and I want you to be a writer. And people who read, if you read too much, you'll never get to write. So you have to read enough to be able to get the ideas, but if you spend the rest of your life reading, you won't be able to write.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we've heard that.
I never heard that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that was part of his kind of philosophy of
Yeah.
how to do things.
Okay, so you finished your PhD in the, early 80s?
1982,
Uh-huh,
I was unemployed.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
There were no jobs in Britain in sociology.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it was a really desperate situation.
Well, I remember what it
Thatcher
like
was
these
in
days.
power.
Yeah.
Remember Thatcher famously said society doesn't exist, there are no jobs.
But you ended up at York, but that was after a gap, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge shock. You've got to understand what this is like. You know, I'd written a book with Harry. I'd got my own various articles done. You're in what you perceive as this cutting-edge field, and then you're on the dole. It's not great.
Well, as you were...
Being on the dole in Britain means you're basically broke.
You were actually on the dole.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
How long was the gap?
I think it was on the dole for about 3 months.
Oh,
And then I ran into, what happened was I was at a conference. Harry sent me to a conference at Deutschlandsberg in Austria.
and you're still living in Bath.
Yeah, I was living in Bath, and I met this guy, this Dutch guy, Weber Baker,
Oh,
and I'd worked on this solar neutrino stuff. I also had, for a time, I had a project on something called solar oblateness, which is another interesting controversy in physics. And I even had a little sign on my door, the Center for the Sociology of the Sun, and it was kind of a joke, you know, that this is what I was doing. And I went to this conference, and I was giving a paper, I think, on the social construction of solar neutrinos, and I met this Dutch guy who was giving a paper on the social construction of the bicycle, and that was Weber Baker. And Weber had come to that conference. It actually was the first meeting ever of East.
Where was the conference again?
In Deutschlandsberg in Austria.
And this was the first East?
This
or
is the
what
first
turned
ever
into
East. Yeah, turned into East, the first ever East meeting. And Weber had come to that meeting because he knew there was this social construction of science stuff going on, and he knew there'd be people there from it, and he had a background in physics as well. And he ran into me. I gave a paper on the social construction of
Yeah. Just a little bit of context. At that time, the strong program had taken off. There were a lot
Absolutely,
of big
yeah,
debates.
yeah.
I think you were at the thing in Toronto where Bloor debated.
No, Harry was at. I wasn't not
Oh,
at
you
that
weren't
meeting,
there.
but
Okay.
the strong program was incredible. I mean, that's we read, you know, Wittgenstein. We also read Bloor and Barnes.
I think you came to the ethnomethodology meeting in Warwick in 1979, maybe?
Who did?
You did you
No.
come to that?
No. I met you, Mike, at Oxford University, where there was a British Sociology of Science Association, BSA, British Sociological Association, Sociology of Science Study Group.
Uh-huh.
And I gave a paper. You were there. Harold Garfinkel was there.
Well, that was the thing at not Warwick University.
Oxford.
At Oxford, at, what's the name of the college there?
Wolfson?
Wolfson.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was 79.
Yeah, Rom Harry was around.
Yeah.
Rom Harry was a professor at Oxford.
Uh-huh.
Well, he actually
Yeah.
wasn't a professor. We discovered he was a senior lecturer or a reader. He never
Uh-huh.
became a
Uh-huh.
professor because it was Oxford. And
Okay. So
I met you there, Mike.
Yeah, so that this stuff was starting to happen, although there was no field of STS at that point. But
There was no field of STS. There was the Liberal Studies of Science program in Manchester. There was the SPRU in Sussex. And we were doing this new thing we were calling the Sociology of Scientific Knowledge.
Mhm. And I
And-
guess that name was in circulation. back
Yeah,
then.
yeah, and they were doing it in Edinburgh. There's the Edinburgh Strong program.
Yeah.
Went to Oxford, met you and Harold Garfinkel and John O'Neill. John O'Neill was a weird guy
Yeah.
because at that whole meeting he never said a word.
Didn't he?
Just sat there like he was in a trance.
Uh-huh. He's-
That kind of intrigued
yeah,
me.
Yeah.
And we met Harold. We went to the bar with Harold Garfinkel. That's when we first realised that Harold Garfinkel was framing it all in terms of Holton. He didn't know what we were doing
Yeah,
either.
well, he's friends of Holton going way back.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
But let me just tell you one other thing.
Yeah.
Meeting Bruno Latour for the first time. So that fieldwork trip to California, Bruno was at the Salk Institute,
right,
and he organised a little meeting at the Salk Institute. And it was my first ever talk in America. So he had a little conference. Karen Knorr-Cetina was there. Aaron Sickle was there. I stayed with Joe Gusfield
Mhm.
in his house.
he just died last year.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Ah, wonderful guy. Wrote some really important early stuff
Do you
on
remember what
disco.
year that was? That was
This was probably about 78, 79,
Okay.
sometime around there.
just as they were finishing the book on laboratory life. then.
Yeah, he was still working, so it must have been 78. It was
Yeah.
probably, it may have even been 77 actually,
Yeah.
thinking about it.
Uh-huh.
So Bruno had this little conference, and I'd never been anything like it. I was, I didn't have, at this stage I was working with Harry, didn't have my PhD, and we were at the Salk Institute. Bruno was there, and Randall Collins was also there as well. And
He was on faculty there.
I mean, people like Aaron Sickle, these were like, legendary people for some master's student to me. And so we're going to give a talk at this little conference at the Salk Institute.
Mhm.
And for some reason, I was giving the first presentation. So there's this conference, all these scientists for the Salk Institute were there, Francis Crick, Jonas Salk himself. And I was talking about parapsychology, this little paper on fraud in parapsychology, which was eventually published in Social Studies of Science, I think my second ever publication. And I gave this, I was so nervous, my first talk in America, and all these famous people there, never mind the scientists, and I give this paper, and how did it go down? And the first question came from Jonas Salk himself, and Jonas Salk said, "This is a really great, important project, because it turns out that Jonas Salk was really into parapsychology." And so he thought this was really interesting. I was talking at the Salk Institute about parapsychology, and once Jonas Salk had spread the holy water on you,
Wow.
so things were great. Here I was.
Your career was launched by
Yeah.
Jonas Salk's parapsychology. That's
So I owe that to Bruno.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question here.
Yeah,
Who first used SSK? Do you know?
that's an interesting question. I don't know. It could have been the Edinburgh School, or it could have been we
I
call
don't
it
think
the
the
Bath
Edinburgh
School.
School used it, but yeah, it'd be
It could
interesting
have
to
come
look
from the Bath School. I just can't remember.
Yeah.
That's what we started to call it. We started to call it SSK.
into. I know Harry used various acronyms, EPOR.
Yeah, that was the empirical program of relativism. That was a bit later. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, You've got to understand how small the field. Let me tell you another story from the early days. How small the field was, and we were at Bath University. It was Harry, me, and David Travis. Three of us. Just
Yeah.
imagine that.
That was the Bath.
That was
School.
Lake Hold the Bath, as Bruno called it.
The Bath School.
And Bruno would come over and give talks because in those days, Bruno was happy to do controversy research, and he was sort of part. He would
Yeah.
he'd present his work as he's doing controversy research in a lab context.
Mhm.
He'd sleep on my couch. Come over to
Yeah.
Bath and give a talk, and so we eventually had this conference at Bath. This is later, but as the field was becoming more prominent, and Harry was so worried that Americans coming over would work out how small it is, so we wouldn't have it at the university, so they could see there's just three of us. So we had a teachers' training college, separate from the university, so they wouldn't get to see how small it
Well, I
was.
remember going to one of the meetings that was at the teachers training college.
Yeah. We had Uses of Experiment there, this thing that led to a book that Simon Schaffer, David Gooding and I edited. And it was a wild time because Harry said, these Americans are coming, they're gonna work out how small this is, and that won't be good.
One other question about the early meeting. There was something called the Fury Conference. Were you part of that?
No, I wasn't part of it, but Harry told me about it. That was the precursor, I think, to the first 4S meeting.
Uh,
It was in a Plymouth Fury
Fury,
car.
Fury is a car. I don't,
Oh, yeah.
that-
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Harry was in it, and he came back from those meetings. He described meeting Bruno at the first 4S meeting at Cornell. I couldn't go. We had no money, so I couldn't go over there to a conference. you know.
76. That would have been.
Yeah, so he went to that, and I said, what was it like? And he said, well, there's this incredible French guy there. This is before we'd been out to California.
Mhm.
And he said he presented slides of the laboratory roof, and it's one of the funniest presentations he'd been to.
Mhm.
And that was Bruno. I guess Steve Wilger was there.
Mhm.
Everett Mendelsohn was a big name in the field at that time. I
Yeah.
remember him coming back saying, Everett Mendelsohn, there's this incredibly sophisticated guy, Everett Mendelsohn, who can answer every question.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move forward to, you've finished, you have this gap, you meet Viva Biker,
Yeah.
then what happens?
So Weber invites me to come to Twente and work on a project with him where I'm comparing my case studies and
And
the
he had
social
some money
construct.
for you to do that?
It's money for me to do it. So yeah, I'm going to. I was completely out of it. I had my little VW white Beetle.
Uh-huh.
I drove on to the ferry from
Yeah.
Harwich to the Hook of Holland. Arrived in the Netherlands
Mhm.
and the Hook of Holland. And I remember, and I was so out of it. I said to this Dutch immigration guy, I said, I'm heading to this place called Onsheed. And he sort of looked at me. What do you mean Onsheed? And so I said, I had to spell it out for him. He said, you mean Enschede. That's where Twente University is, and it's right in the sticks, the middle of nowhere. And I was there in the middle of nowhere, I think for 6 months, with Weber, and we were in a place called the Boerderij, which is Dutch for the farm, a really beautiful building. And under the leadership of this guy, Peter Bosma, and that's when we developed the idea of writing a paper comparing the sociology of science to the sociology of technology, and that came to the whole social construction Scott thing.
Right, and that's being documented.
Yeah,
by
we
one
had
of our
conferences
students.
on it. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
you'd seen.
yeah. So that's how I met Weber, and we had a very productive time, and you could see immediately that that you could apply some of these ideas we were developing at Bath, the empirical program of relativism, interpretive flexibility had been developed, closure, the impact of the wider society. You could think about technology in those terms. Just a question of which case study we use. And once Weber had this bicycle case study. It was so great.
Mhm.
It was the perfect study for it, and it was one of the most developed of his. He had 6 case studies.
Mhm. And
So
then,
we did.
of course,
Yeah.
you submitted that to Social Studies of Science, it was published in '84.
Yeah, it wasn't called Scott then, though. It was called something Unification Program. We went up to. I was giving a talk up in Edinburgh University, and David Edge said you can't call it something like the Unification because at the time there was the Church of Unification, which was the Moonies. And David said you don't want to be associated with the Moonies, so he said you can't call it this Unification Program. So he said let's think of another name. It's David Edge who actually came up with the name Scott, Social Construction of Technology, and because he's Scottish, we thought this is a great name. So we said nice one, David. Yeah, Scott.
As you know,
Yeah.
in the history of this, there was some hesitancy in Social Studies of Science to move into that area, right?
Yeah, Harry didn't get it. People thought it wasn't epistemologically challenging. They said, so everyone knows technology is social anyway, so why are you spending your time doing that? And we would argue about, well, actually, most engineers are kind of technologically determinist. There is something to be argued here. It was interesting. People didn't immediately see the relevance of that. And I was working still on solar neutrinos. I had this paper on the externality of scientific observations, which was
That's a great paper, 85, Social Studies of Science.
Yeah, and people love that paper. It's the same year, actually it was 84, the same year as I did the social construction of technology. Because I remember Harry saying to me, that paper, that's a discovery. He had always said this realist way of presenting the works.
Yeah.
That's a discovery, Trevor. That social construction technology thing, well, that's sort of okay,
Yeah. David was important for a lot of people learning
Absolutely.
how to do writing and organizing papers for publication.
God, I miss David Age. He sort of looked after our field, and he would. This is amazing because this is before the internet. He would always clip a little things to do with your field. So I'd get appearing just in the mail a little clip about what something happening in solar neutrino science.
Plus a thing about Norwich or
Plus the
something.
thing about my sports team, Norwich City, who he would follow. He was a mad sports fanatic,
Yeah.
and he
Yeah,
would send
every
you.
sport under the sun.
Yeah, it was incredible. But he would, you knew with David there, and he would be shepherding you through this work, and he was always kind of there. He was, he was helping us, and it was just
So it was about that time you had that Young Blood Fellowship? Or
New Blood.
New Blood.
So what happened was there were no jobs. So I'd done this thing with Weber. This is before it was published. I came back to Bath. There were no jobs in Bath. I was unemployed again on the dole. So I'd done this project with Weber, and I thought this was an interesting project. I was publishing this thing on the in externality. So in my own mind, I'd written a book on parapsychology. I was kind of like, had been successful, but there was still no jobs. So I was really desperate. I started to apply for all sorts of jobs, and I applied for administrative jobs. Couldn't get them because I had all these publications. And they thought I would never make it as an administrator. And
This
then
is
I got,
actually, not to interrupt too badly, but this is actually inspiration for some of our students on the job market today if they can hang in there. Good things
absolutely,
can happen.
yeah. I mean, it was a really tough time, and I knew I had done this work, and I just hoped I'd get a job. And I remember, out of the blue, I got a letter inviting me for an interview for a job at York University, where Michael Mulcahy was. He was going on leave for a year. It was a 2-year job, and the other year was going to be replacing a famous British sociologist called Laurie Taylor, a media sociologist, Laurie Taylor. So I'd be replacing the two of us. It was a 2-year job. I went up to interview, and I thought, probably not going to get this, because I didn't know any sociology. They wanted me to teach introductory sociology, the real deal. York was a great sociology department. I had a typical British PhD in sociology. I'd learned everything from Harry and Richard Whitley. So how was I going to teach Goffman, Weber, all this stuff? I remember Laurie Taylor asking me this question, how was I going to do it? And I said, well, I don't know much sociology, I said, but I'm going to be reading the stuff with the students. I'll be a few pages ahead of them, and I'll probably tell a joke or two. And Laurie Taylor apparently liked that.
Yeah, very good.
And so they hit Mulcahy, and the reason Mulcahy liked me, I'd done a review, and I always
You
say,
you hadn't met him before?
I've never met him before. I've done a review of his book. You know that book, Science and the Sociology of
Yeah.
Knowledge?
It's a very key book.
Yeah, and I'd reviewed it for the 4S newsletter. And I'd started to do, it was one of my first ever book reviews, and Mike Mulcahy gave me the job, he told me, because he read that review, and he said, I was one of the few people that actually appreciated what a great book that was. Most people, he had got typical academic, had lots of enemies, and people were always sort of mealy-mouthed in their praise for him. I was just like, this is a great book. And he was really thrilled by that, and so that's another reason I got the job. So it was a 2-year job, and just to show you how desperate things were, if you've been unemployed, been on the dole, you know what this is like. I had a girlfriend with a little kid, and I remember this when the letter came, this was before email and all that stuff, I jumped up and said to this Laura, her name was, she was 3 or 4 years old, I said, I got a job. And they were just dancing around like crazy, because it meant that much to me, because I could tell that was the difference between, so many people weren't getting jobs, and I probably would have had a very different life if I hadn't got that job.
Yeah. So you were at York for how long?
That was just this 2-year job, and then we had another break because Laurie Taylor was a pretty inventive guy. And
By
these
the way,
new,
if you don't, do you know who Laurie Taylor is?
I've heard of the name.
Yeah, I don't know if he still writes that column for the Times Higher Education.
when I say he's a media sociologist, he actually studied. He was a criminologist. He did sociology of deviance. He wrote a book with Stan Cohen, who's a fantastic sociologist at the time. Stan Cohen's the guy who came up with, what's that phrase for, not normalization of deviance, that's moral panic. Moral panic. Stan Cohen's the guy who invented the notion of the moral panic, study of the mods and rockers. And so Laurie was, he's a really, and he was in the media all the time. He was very charismatic. He had his own column on the back of the Times Higher Education supplement. He had his own radio show. He's still got it to this day. It's called Thinking Aloud. And so after I'd done my 2-year temporary lectureship, this new thing came because they realised there were no jobs in British universities. Everything was contracted under Margaret Thatcher. And these new positions were developed called New Blood lectureships. And this was a thing where a department could apply for it. So Laurie said to me, he said, what we're going to do is you're going to write the job application yourself, and it will look convincing. and then we'll give you the job if we get it. So we were in competition with all the other universities in Britain, but it had a lot of credibility because I'd written it specifically for a sociologist of science, and we got it. There were only 2 in Britain that year. We got it, but then it was awful because would I get the job? Because I'd written it, but they had to, they had to go through this process of interviewing everybody, and I was so nervous because I thought if I blow this,
Back on the dole.
yeah, exactly. And I don't think I did very well, but I was going to a meeting I always remember this. It was in Stockholm, a European group of organisational sociology. I was going to this meeting, and I was at Heathrow Airport, and I called back to York to see if I got the job. And it was Mulcahy. I called Mulcahy. He told me, "Yeah, you got the job." So I got this new blood lectureship. It's like a 5-year position.
Job interviews in Britain last 1 day, and the job is given at the end of the day. So,
Yeah, incredibly short.
Yeah.
And but I always remember this because I was so thrilled I got it. I went straight to the bar, sank about 3 or 4 drinks, and then lost my ticket to Sweden. And I was drunk at Heathrow trying to remember where I left my ticket. I found it somewhere, but there was no big security.
So this was when, about 85, 86, something like that?
Yeah, it would have been 85, I think, yeah.
And then you stayed there for another 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And I was working with Mulcahy, and Malcolm Ashmore was there. Yeah.
Well, Malcolm was there then.
Yeah, Malcolm was there. He was he'd done his PhD on reflexivity. We had a project from the SSRC on health economics. We wrote a book on health economics together.
Oh, that's right.
So it was interesting working with Mulcahy, by the way, because I'd worked with Harry, and he'd showed me how to do all these interviews and how to write and so on. Mulcahy showed me how to teach. Mulcahy was the greatest teacher I've ever seen.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah,
Because
fantastic.
he's such a deadpan guy.
Oh no, he was a fantastic teacher, and he had this skill that he'd talk with the students. The students, asked them questions, and they would give some fairly muddled answer, and he'd always pick out the bit of gold in the answer and turn it back on them, and this would give them confidence. And he was, Harry would just say, "That's crap," and imply that you shouldn't be in the same room as the great Harry. Mulcahy was a gentler style of teaching, so I learned a lot from him. Very different style than Harry. And he was a good writer as well, Mulcahy.
I remember at some point you told me that the health economics book was the most, the biggest seller, the most cited book you had, or something at one point.
Yeah, it did incredibly well. It was, but it wasn't known in our field because it was, we were into reflexivity. So the book, had a 5-act play in it, where a part was played by the tape recorder. It had press clippings. We were interested in health economists in the media, and we presented that chapter as like a newspaper. It had 3 different conclusions. So it was a bit wild, I think, for people who weren't into...
This was about the time you wrote a kind of protest against that with authoring with yourself.
Yeah, we had these discourse analysis workshops where people like Jonathan Potter, Steve Woolgar, Malcolm Ashmore would come. Steve Woolgar, I mentioned already, was there. And we present sort of interesting stuff. Mulcahy was into reflexivity. We're doing discourse analysis, and I was kind of critical of reflexivity, and I thought an interesting way to criticize it would be to write a reflexive text. So I did this 2-voice text with a senior Trevor Pinch and a junior Trevor Pinch. And, the junior author was opposed to was in favor of reflexivity being junior. The senior author, the first author, also called Trevor Pinch, was in favor of it. Was opposed to it, so let's get this right. The senior author was opposed to it, the junior author was in favour of it, and we argued in the text with each other. It's kind of crazy. Then I would have to present this text, and I'd move across the stage, and sort of Steve Woolgar taught me this technique for moving across the stage. You'd read one voice, then read the other voice.
Oh, yeah.
And then when I presented it at Reading University, and the senior author won the argument. So I presented in a way that the senior author had the last word. Then I remember I presented a 4S meeting at Worcester Polytechnic.
Is that where you met Colin Campbell? What's his name?
Donald Campbell.
No, the guy who wrote the thing on selling.
Oh, that's Colin Clark. Colin Clark was a PhD student. But I did meet Don Campbell, the great Don Campbell.
Yeah, the late great.
So I presented this at Worcester Polytechnic at the 4S meeting, and then the junior author won.
Oh.
And so it was kind of crazy project to do, wasn't it? Present your own work with 2 different voices, but in one case one author won, the next case the other author won the debate with myself.
But This is about the point the school bus book got published, right? The social construction.
Yeah, well, we had a conference, you know, so we'd written that book, the article on the social construction of technological systems, and then we decided to have a conference. We decided to have a conference in the Netherlands. And that conference was a kind of landmark conference because, you know, a bunch of historians of technology came, like famously Tom Hughes, Ed Constant, sociologists of technology. Bruno was there, doing the early stuff that led to Science in Action. Michel Callan was there, John Law was there, presenting, and so that led to that book, the school bus book. And Tom Hughes was lucky, or we were lucky enough to have Tom Hughes author that thing with us. Maybe he was lucky to work with us, I don't know. But we were nobodies, that was the amazing thing. I just realised in hindsight that Tom Hughes is the same age as I am when he did that with us.
Oh, really?
And he's a famous guy, he got an endowed chair at University of Pennsylvania. He is the man in the history of technology. And he did this with Weber and me, who'd never trained a student in our life. And at that point, we still didn't have permanent jobs, either Weber or me. And he edited this book with us. What a break.
Yeah.
Shapin told me, he said, that was amazing how you did that with Tom Hughes, because Shapin...
He came out of there.
He came out of there, just knew what a big deal Tom Hughes was. And that was kind of nice.
Okay. Anything else you want to add to your York years of note before?
Well, the selling thing, I worked on selling stuff, studying sellers with Colin Clark.
Kind of a conversation analytic.
Yeah, I thought, what are you going to do? You're in York. I'm always interested in learning. You learn from the people you're with. I learned from Harry, I learned from Michael Mulcahy. And there was this incredible CA group there. Paul Drew, Tony Wotton, and they were doing, Gail Jefferson would come over, Anita Pomerantz, so I was hanging out with these people. Why not learn from them? And so I was learning some CA from them, and we did video analysis of sellers and wrote a book on that. And there was a PhD student at Paul Drew's, Colin Clark, who I did that
So
book
he was
with.
at York at the time?
Yeah, and I think you came over to York, because you were in the CA world then as well,
Well,
Mike.
kind of. I was in the Garfinkel camp.
Yeah.
But, yeah. And
I remember seeing the tapes.
Yeah.
When I came down
You-
for a visit.
Oh yeah, you hang out. Tom Guerin came over there to York as well, and remember Calgary with Gus Brannigan?
Oh, yeah.
That was what year was
The
that?
beekeeping.
Beekeeping, yeah.
That
So we
was,
went to a conference. Mike and I went to a conference, and then Gus Brannigan has vanished from the field, but he wrote this great book.
He actually wrote a more recent book on the history of social psych, which is very good.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
He did that one on the social process of scientific discovery. I guess it was his PhD. Fantastic book.
Yeah. I visited him a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and we had a great time out there in his
Yeah.
ranch in the Rocky Mountains.
You know, his
In
wife
Calgary.
developed an allergy to bee stings, so he had to stop the beekeeping.
There's a famous picture of Mike and I beekeeping. We
Yeah,
all
with
got the
hats
garb
and
on.
the nets and stuff. Yeah. Yeah. There's
We should
a funny
find that
story
picture
about
and put it on the
the
website.
ride back too, the flat tire and stuff. But
Yeah, that's right. I nearly missed the plane. Yeah.
yeah.
Back to I guess it was in the Netherlands during that conference. Yeah, because I was
Oh,
flying to
okay.
Amsterdam. Yeah.
It was the early '80s, if I remember.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
So
that's the York days. So
Yeah,
how do I
but-
get to Cornell is what you're going to ask me next,
you
Mike.
were pretty well established, I think. You know, you did some work that got pretty visible.
Yeah, the social
And-
construction of technology and the
and,
stuff on science was people were starting to realize this is an
4S
interesting...
was launched, and
Yeah,
STS was becoming a thing. I don't know if the term STS was used at that point,
Yeah.
but it
So-
was becoming visible, especially in England.
yeah, it was becoming visible, and suddenly, from being this guy who hadn't got a job and was this junior lecturer at York with this new blood lectureship, people said there's a chair at Keele, you should apply for it. And I did apply, but I didn't get it. And there's a chair at Loughborough with this guy, a really great group, a guy called Mick Billick, and I went there, was interviewed, and didn't get it. So from being kind of like a nobody, this was really taking off. Then I got a letter out of the blue, still no, before email, from Sheila Jasanoff. And it was like, would you like to edit what turned out to be the second handbook in STS?
Oh, it started that early. Okay.
Started that early. I got this letter from her from York, and there was a PS to that, and by the way, we have a job at Cornell. Maybe you'd be interested in applying. And that was the job at Cornell I eventually got.
And it was 89, 90, something like that.
So I figured I'd been interviewing for professorships in England and I hadn't got them. Why not try for this one in America? I'd done a lot of my field work in America on the solar neutrino books. I'd actually even visited Cornell before, and so I knew a little bit about Cornell. So I thought, let's apply for this job. And I got it.
Was that job associated with the NSF grant and the formation of the department?
Yep, absolutely. Sheila had a big NSF grant, and she made me a PI on that grant. And that was a research training grant, and that was enough money to have a graduate program at Cornell. We didn't have a
Some
department.
postdocs too, right?
Yeah, postdocs. And the idea was that I was going to come over there, whoever got that job. By the way, Tom Gearan had been offered that job, but he didn't want to live in Ithaca. I think that's probably correct. So he went back to, he did a year there. And
Lee Starr and I also interviewed for that job. Do you remember that?
well, you know, I wouldn't know who else was interviewed, because it's not like in Britain we're all together in the
Yeah,
room
that's
on
right,
the same day.
Yeah.
But I had heard
You
subsequently,
and Lee,
yeah.
him all.
We were the three who were interviewed, yeah.
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 Well, anyway, some miracle I got that job,
Mhm.
so I was in I had to get tenure, and that was, I guess, by that stage not so hard to get.
Mhm.
It was an associate professorship, and the job specification was to build up the graduate program.
Mhm.
So we had this new NSF grant, and we started to build up that
Mhm.
graduate
Mhm.
program. And the moral of the story is I'd done all this work beforehand. And why were they remember Shaping got a job on the West Coast?
Yeah,
Bruno
well,
was coming over.
Because they had a parallel grant from NSF to build the science
Yeah.
studies program.
But here's, I think, the bottom line of why are they, by this point I was a well-known British sociologist, because, you know, this stuff had taken off. But why aren't there people in America getting these jobs? And, I mean, Tom Gearan was a possibility. He was Merton's last
Yeah,
student, and he'd
yeah.
got SSK. So he could have had that job.
Mhm.
But there wasn't like there were hundreds of people who could
No.
get this job, because no one had been trained in SSK.
Yeah,
Because this approach had come from Europe.
yeah.
I guess you and Lee were the two
Yeah,
exceptions.
coming from kind of peripheral areas of sociology.
Yeah, so it was
Yeah.
strange. And the job wasn't, Sheila had set it up, so it wasn't in sociology, because there was a big fight about that.
Mhm.
Because she couldn't have got that job. The sociologists wouldn't have hired me.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have hired you, they wouldn't have
No.
hired Lee.
No, yeah. Okay, so when you first got there in the early 90s, the department formed soon after that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And,
A couple of years, a lot of bureaucracy to do, because it's, Cornell is a state university as well, State University of New York, so we had to go through Albany to get a new graduate program, and I had to do that, and
Mhm.
we started to get PhD students. We didn't know it would be a success, because we hadn't trained. It's a new field of science and technology studies. Would they get jobs?
and what were you working on at the time for research?
I was writing the handbook with
Okay.
Sheila. I was writing the first article I wrote on testing.
Oh, that was then.
Yeah, because just before I'd come to Cornell, actually there was on the transition. One thing that happened that's kind of interesting was that I'd been invited to a meeting at Bath, which led to the epistemological chicken debate. But I couldn't go because I was moving to Cornell, and that was a debate between Harry Collins and Bruno Latour. And Harry wanted me to write epistemological chicken article with him, but
He recruited Steve.
he recruited Steve Yearley to write it with me. And I remember calling up Harry from America, so asking him how that meeting had gone, and I've never known the guy so depressed. And so I said, "So what's wrong, Harry?" And he said, we're trained in Britain to debate things by just sort of pinning down one thing. And Bruno, he's like a juggler. He's got like 6 balls in the air. You just try and understand one thing. He's got another ball going round. And this is how his metaphor. And he said he just found that very depressing. And there's some truth in that. It was a style thing between a British way of doing things and what Bruno was into.
Was that one of the quinquennial meetings that happened at?
No, it wasn't. That was just a small meeting. It was written up by Herod de Vries, I think, in either the
Yeah, I
East
remember,
Newsletter.
yeah, okay.
He was
So
he
it
was
was-
there as well, and he interpreted it all as
Yeah.
as a clash between a different continental philosophy style and a British empiricism
Yeah.
thing that Harry was into.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Yeah. So that happened just as I came, and then I'd spent the summer with Bernard Jurgis in the Berlin Wall had just come down. It was 1990.
Right.
So that was the Pink Floyd played the Wall concert in Berlin that summer. What a great time to be in Berlin. And I was writing about testing. There were these cigarette ads everywhere. Test the West. I thought this is kind of interesting to write about. So I read about testing. And so I was working on that at the time.
You didn't start your Moog synthesizer project by then, did you?
No, that came in about 95.
Okay.
And I slowly realised, through being at Cornell, that this guy, Robert, I always thought it was Moog, because I thought it was a made-up name. I thought it was Moog, the sound of the synthesizer. And I realised there was a real engineer called Robert Moog, and he'd been at Cornell, and he was building synthesizers in this tiny little place north of Ithaca. And as I'd played and built synthesizers, so this was a chance to revisit my psychedelic roots. It's very rare that this happens in your life, that you get to study something you're passionate about. So I had that career as a psychedelic musician that hadn't gone anywhere, become an academic, and I could revisit it through the lens of being an academic, because I was doing sociology technology, this was technology, and I could do it legitimately. And how many projects can you do where you can interview engineers and rock stars, and it's kind of legitimate research? And I got a grant from the Smithsonian Lemonson Center for the Study of Innovation. This guy, Frank Trocco, who was doing a PhD, joined me, and we did the interviews around America, and we were interviewing the synthesizer player from Frank Zappa, Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I thought, man, this is research, this is great. And nobody had written that book on Moog, which was amazing, because he'd been marginalised, because the Cornell music department was a pretty straight music department. They didn't understand what this weird electronic stuff this guy Robert Moog was doing.
Did you start the Golem books after you got to Cornell? Or
Yeah, it was at Cornell, and the history of that is it was Harry's project. He'd been working on it originally with Steve Shapin. Steve had kind of vanished
With
from it.
Steve, really?
Yes, they'd been talking about it together. They were going to redo the Harvard case studies that Conan had done, and they had hit this idea. And then I don't quite know what happened, but Steve didn't want to do it, or something. You should ask Harry about that. Why? I don't know. And Harry was looking for another co-author, and since we'd written together, the only condition was that I would have to write one of my case studies, and he had to see if I could write in this popular way. He didn't know if I could. I didn't know if I could. So I did my solar neutrino one, and so this is the guy who'd said I couldn't write, and Harry's to this day, he would agree that was the best written chapter in the first Golem. And he actually had the grace to say that. And I thought, great. And he said, well, we're going to do this book. You know how to do this, Trevor. And so I could write in that popular way.
How many of them are there now? 5? 4?
3.
3.
We did this Golem book, and
Then there was technology and medicine.
it was on science, controversies in science, and we did one on technology, Golem at Large. Park Dewing came up with the title of that on the golf course. Harry would come over, and we'd try and play golf together, and Park would play with us, and we were out there shooting golf balls, and he came up with the idea of Golem at Large as a title. And then we did Dr. Golem, and we're writing Dr. Golem led to some disagreements with Harry, so we haven't ever done the 4th Golem, which is a teaching Golem, but we've got bits of it.
And the disagreement was over the vaccines, right?
That's right, yeah. It was but we turned it to something positive, because we realised, why are we fighting? Harry would sit in my basement in Ithaca writing Golems with me. This had worked for a long time. And we'd written other papers. He'd come over, we'd done this paper on the vet school skill, on the vet school.
The ferrets.
The ferrets paper, about ferrets were on the operating table, and we wrote about that. And then suddenly we're in the middle of this enormous row about vaccination, where Harry wanted me to write things in the Golem as a co-author. At this point, the Pinch family are acting irrationally, because he'd followed our family, and I was an old hippie, and so we weren't anti-vaccination, but we were much more critical than Harry was about it. So we had a different path in vaccinating our kids than him. And he just thought I think he thought I was irrational or crazy, and he wanted me to sign off saying this.
There was also the herd issue too, wasn't there?
Yeah. He had, he thought we were irresponsible delaying with one vaccine our daughter's vaccination, and we thought that we were being responsible. So that's all argued out in the footnotes there.
I wonder if that marks a transition from Harry the skeptic to Harry the trusting science. And
Could be around this point that there's a shift in Professor Collins's views of the world. It could be.
What years are we talking about here?
So we're talking in let me see. I think this is around 2000 and beginning of 2000, I'd say.
Well,
around that period. Pretty late. Dr. Golem was a very late book.
Because the
So third
third wave came out in 2002.
Yeah. And the third wave came out after Harry had come to Cornell and a conference on expertise, and I remember him fuming away. He said, "No one here is doing it right." And so he wrote that third wave stuff, which I've never been that enamoured with, as you know. I don't like the term. But.
So, I mean, you've been at Cornell for over 20 years, so there's plenty to talk about there, but...
Yeah, your arrival, Mike, and that's...
You made that possible, among others, but certainly you did.
So Sheila left and we got Mike.
Yeah.
Same time.
Yeah, he got Sheila's job, yeah. And
I didn't try to impersonate.
Mike and I were, we'd known each other because when he was at BU, my daughter learned to walk in his apartment in Cambridge,
Somerville.
Somerville, yeah. Did her first. It was a regular place to visit Mike when he was at BU.
Yeah, and I stayed at your place in '86, I think it was, or '85. When
Taught me how to make guacamole. I didn't know how to
Did
make
I?
guacamole. And that was Mike and his
All
wife
right.
Nancy does that.
So, I mean, there's lots to talk about
Yeah.
now, but I mean, maybe we should mention some, you probably didn't have the opportunity before you came to Cornell to work with many PhD students, right? And there were some, I guess, at York. but-
Colin Clark was the only one.
Yeah.
It wasn't even my PhD student.
Uh-huh,
We didn't have, Britain, if you look
Yeah.
at this field, the only person who trained PhD students successfully was Michael Mulcahy. Harry wasn't training them. I was his PhD student, I suppose,
Yeah,
but I think
yeah.
he doesn't have very many, and it just didn't seem to be in Britain it's tough to get PhD students. So suddenly we had, in this big program at
No, I remember
Cornell,
that.
we had a bunch, so people like Simon Cole, Sama Alatu, Saul Hoffman, Shabita came through the program, Nicole, so many great PhD students, Heidi Boskell.
This meeting, you see them everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, and they all got jobs. That was him. When we started, we didn't know. I think we knew we could train them, but we
Yeah.
didn't know if they'd get jobs.
Yeah.
And they were starting to get jobs and good jobs.
Yeah.
They would typically have a postdoc and then go on and get a
Yeah.
assistant professorship. But
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and then I went, and then we had Shaping on the West Coast. They were kind of doing this San Diego. The difference was that San Diego was based on a program in science studies.
Yeah, departmentally based. With
Yeah, so it's so you had to do your PhD through a department, where Cornell had its own department, and it wasn't clear which was the best model.
Well, I thought the department was.
It turned out, I think the department gave more stability.
Yeah.
So I did a time out with Steve Shapen was out. He invited me out, so I taught out there and met a whole bunch of really great UCSD grad students like Bart Simon.
Those were golden years, weren't
Patrick
they?
Carroll, Karis.
Yeah.
Cousins.
Golden years.
Golden years. That's the voice of Patrick Carroll. We should declare who's sitting over
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Listening with great interest.
Yeah.
Ben Sims, Charlie Thorpe, they were all. So that were, Cornell had a bunch of great grads, but UCSD did as well. So the thing worked, in a sense,
Yeah.
building these new science studies. When you look back in hindsight, this to try and build this new field up really did work. And these two places at that point, and there was other places because there was the MIT program, there was RPI, BPI, and there was lots of stuff going on.
So you were chair of the Cornell department for what, 7 years or something like that?
7 or 8 years,
Yeah,
yeah. After
yeah.
Sheila left, I was temporary chair for a year when she was away on sabbatical. Then I became chair when she left. Yeah. And I realised at that point I probably didn't want to do administration.
Yeah.
I was a different style. Sheila was a fantastic builder of programs. She built our program up, and that was her great skill. And she had many skills, but that was one of them. And I wasn't really a builder. I could see that. I just said, look, we're going to do this collectively, and if we screw up together, and delegate as much stuff as possible.
But
And
by
that
then
was my style.
the department was sailing along pretty well.
The groundwork had been done. It was just kind of a question of just continuing and doing what we did so well by that point. It was an exciting place. You arrived. We had Peter Dare there. We had Ron Klein. Ron Klein had written more on technology. We'd written about the interpretive flexibility in users. Then I met Nellie Outsham. We were writing about users and
Right.
users of technology.
But
So it was
you
an
also-
exciting time.
You increasingly got into sound studies and,
Yeah, for writing the book on Moog, I realised that sound was the bigger topic. I hadn't realised that. I thought it was about musical instruments, and I realised sound is the bigger topic. So then Weber had invited me over to Maastricht. I met Karen Besterfeld, and she worked on sound with me, wrote early papers, and so we
you
edited
did that
book.
special issue of Social Studies.
Yeah, we did a special issue.
Yeah.
We called it music. We presented that at Bielefeld 4S meeting, and we called it Facing the Music.
Mm.
And we were going to do a special issue for David Edge, and it never happened. So it finally came out much, much later. The field wasn't ready for that stuff then.
And then, of course, you were president of the 4S not too long ago.
Yep, I was, I guess Gary's just been president, so I was Gary's predecessor, yeah. And
What do you think were the major events during your 2 years?
well, we had the biggest meeting ever, I think, the joint one with East in Copenhagen. And that was a wonderful meeting. It was, you know, I have very fond memories because I spent some time doing research, and there were just so many nice things about it. You know, meeting back with the Europeans. Alan Irwin, who's an old pal of ours, was the dean of the business school where the meeting was.
He and Maya Horst really facilitated that one.
And they had great social stuff. You know, I'm always a great believer, and you did this into your presidency, that going to a meeting should be a fun thing. And so, you know, you've got to have, lots of parties as well, and a great banquet, and...
And of course, Wes was a partner in crime in these things.
Yeah. We had... Wes and I bonded together. Kindred spirits. Yeah.
Of course, there was a major reorganization under your stewardship also.
Yeah, well, we had to address this governance issue, I guess. So Wes had loyally served the society. How many years was it? 20? Amsterdam, I was at that meeting. That's when you... Yeah. And...
Well, we were talking about 27 yesterday.
Yeah, the society was getting bigger.
It's
And
too big.
we couldn't let Wes do everything, because what we were worried about, he was the collective memory. I was worried, what if something happened to Wes? Would this society continue? Because he was the kind of collective memory of everything. And I think Wes, he could speak for himself, was also thinking that he was great at many things, but there was just too much for him to do.
Yeah.
And so the meeting organisation, which has become the thing that he does so well. So we sort of changed the governments, so we have an elected. Do we have an elected treasurer and secretary these days?
I think so. That's what we
Yeah.
said.
No, they're appointed.
Oh, they're appointed.
They're appointed, yeah.
Here we decided it
Well, we just-
on the committee. Forgot it already.
Yeah.
but,
It's not me, so.
it's
Yeah.
on record.
Yeah, and so the other thing that I'm proud of under my presidency, and this again goes to my relationship with Wes, who's been a filmmaker all his life, that we brought in films into 4S for the first time, so people had a track of showing movies, which I hope will continue forever. That's another thing that came out.
Let's do one final question, and then if you have anything we haven't covered, you could add it. The final question is, you've been part of this field for over 30 years.
Yeah, my first 4S meeting was the second. I guess it wasn't that first one, it was the next one.
What do you make of the trajectory of the society, current, future trajectory?
Well, it's a big, rambunctious, funky society. It's got so huge, and I think when it was smaller, and SSK was the kind of dominant, people say you're doing lab studies or controversy studies, and it was kind of nice. But now it's just like, like 20 parallel streams. There's just so much stuff happening. But it's still an incredibly friendly meeting, and it's important for what's so great about this meeting is, and this happened to me, that new scholars can meet the more senior scholars in the field, and they just really get on well together. We've got something going here where they can learn from each other, and maybe that's to do with the social side of 4S. I don't know, and it's always been a great meeting for that. So anyone, it's usually the usual story. They're out there. That I'm doing this weird stuff on science, medicine, whatever. Technology, and where am I going to present this? 4S, I've discovered 4S, and people find it as their home. And so that's been my observation of 4S. It's always been a place for these kindred spirits to meet, and they and it's got bigger, and the other societies seem to be, I'm not sort of boasting about it, but it does seem to be going from strength to strength in terms of size anyway. There's always worries about this thing spinning out of control ever since I've been in it. I've just realised it's just going to spin. We'll always have that worry.
Yeah.
And, you know, in 10 years, people will be saying the same thing. Maybe in, hopefully, 100 years, this is out of control.
Okay, last word. Is there anything you'd want to add to what we've said so far?
No, this field's only just getting going.
Yeah.
Another thing you've noticed, just we just add one thing that's kind of interesting. I just reflected on that today. In the old days, people were doing much more in the content of science. I mean, this is, I started off in physics. That has been a change over time. And I feel we'll return to that.
Yeah.
You know, it's strange. You do a couple of studies, and everyone says, it's been done. You know, controversies in physics have been done. You do a lab study, lab studies have been done. They've never been done.
No.
And the excitement...
Well, this is Park Dewing's argument, isn't it?
Yeah, the excitement of the field is, and so I will end with this, is that unlike other fields, our object, science, technology and medicine, is dynamic and constantly changing. So I think this forces us to be smart as well, and you can't take things for granted, and this will, I think, you know, rekindle the field, and this is what we've got going for us. It's actually our object, it's exciting.
I think that's a good place to end.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.